And welcome back to another episode of Detonation. Today we have Dave Lee. Dave Lee is an expert. He's got a huge YouTube channel and he's an expert on China. We're really happy to have you here, Dave, because you've got all the answers and I've got all the questions. So just tell the audience who you are and how you got into China and why you like China and all the other stuff.
Well, I guess I like Australia. That's probably the best answer. I like Australia. I like to keep Australia safe. I like a prosperous, safe Australia. And I discovered, like many other people, that China's the biggest threat, not only to Australia, but to Asia and every other country in Asia. And so therefore I started having a close look at China, traveling there, and trying to study what's going on over there.
Yeah, so you studied at the Hong Kong University. You've seen firsthand the impacts of the Chinese firewall and how the information is totally destroyed once you head over that side. You have a hypothesis which I want to talk about. So your hypothesis is the domino theory. In the old communist versus capitalist war, we had the domino theory that once Vietnam fell, all these other countries would fall to communism. Your theory is a domino theory, but it's a 21st century theory, and it's about if Hong Kong falls, this extradition treaty falls, and say Taiwan falls, the rest of Southeast Asia and broader Asia falls. Could you explain to people that theory and why Hong Kong, for example, in this extradition treaty, is so important? Why are there so many mass protests in Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong already has fallen. Hong Kong will eventually be just another city in China, and there's a possibility the firewall will cover Hong Kong within the years that they have left, 26, 27 years they have left. So that's inevitable. Taiwan is not inevitable. The theory is that China will want to become the Asian hegemon. They'll want to rule every country in Asia. And they're projected, if they keep growing the way they are, they're projected to have a $40 trillion economy by 2030. If they keep growing the way they are at the moment.
That's a huge impact on the Asia region. I tell you, China is one of my favorite countries because it's such an old country. It has so many people there. It's based on all the big river systems. They're highly developed people in certain respects. They did gunpowder, they did paper, they did writing, but they do have a sinister side. I describe the geographical complexity of China as a giant set of lungs, because every time they get a chance, they expand. They crush other countries and other nations, but then they always end up fighting themselves. They always come back in, they retract, they go back to their thing. What do you see in the historical context of China? Do you see, how do you see that? How do you see their empire cyclical idea?
Yeah, well, for the last, say, 2,000 years, they have exactly how you said that. They grow and then they expand and then they go into a decline and civil war, and that's happened many times throughout history. I identify 4 times: the Qing dynasty, the Han dynasty, when the Mongols created the Yuan. Many times that has happened, and then they have broken up and gone into civil war. And now we're into the most recent one where they blame the West for the Opium War. They blame the West for, keep in mind, Britain wasn't the only actor there. Russia invaded as well, and Japan and France. They all got involved in tearing apart China the last time, and now China has risen again. And we are in the expanse period, and they have learnt. They're holding a grudge. The Opium Wars is being taught in schools all over China. I guess you did bring up what's happening in Hong Kong, and in 2014, the Umbrella Movement was about it was about electoral reform, but it was also about propaganda being taught in schools, and that's what Joshua Wong was mainly protesting about, because they were teaching in schools this Chinese Communist Party propaganda, which is pretty much anti-Western, anti-capitalism, anti-democracy, pretty much anti-white men too, by the way. So they're on the expanse right now, that's for sure.
So right now they're in an expanse period, and you see that period as having a global ambition, or a localized Asia, Northeast Asia, or Southeast Asia, or a more global ambition. Where do you see that if they're going to expand, where are they expanding? Are they expanding into the stands? Are they going to go up into Siberia? Are they going to go across into Japan? Where are they going if they're expanding?
Every time over the last 2,000 years, if you look at every time they've expanded, they've created the Silk Road, which has gone by land. They've always been a land power, and they've gone through to Europe that way. And they have learned that from the Opium Wars that they need a huge navy, and America became the global hegemon, and they're a sea power. They ruled the Western Hemisphere, and they created a huge navy to rule the world. And China's learned from that. So China is now building a huge navy. They've militarized the South China Sea, and now they're trying to militarize all around Australia. They're trying to, since Australia signed in 2017, we created a foreign policy white paper, and we didn't specifically mention China, but back in 2017 it was quite clear who we were talking about. And since then, China has been aggressively trading with our neighbors. They signed in November 2018 a $20 billion 3-year bilateral currency swap with Indonesia. They're trading heavily with New Zealand. They're trying to deconstruct Papua New Guinea. There's been times where Facebook has been shut off, so we don't know what's going on in Papua New Guinea sometimes. They're trading with the South Pacific nations. They are surrounding us right now, and it's not looking too good for us.
Australia is a very small country, and we only have a small population. We have a crazy big geography, a huge amount of desert, and we haven't worked out our water issues yet or anything like that. Do they see us as a strong player because we're technically a middle power? Are they a strong player? Are we a strong player to them, or are we just a weak middle power? Because we're a long way. I mean, geographically, we're a long way away from Beijing, right? So, is that a saving grace, or is that not mattering right now? Because they are stuck in the Southeast China Sea. That's what, when people open up the news, they go, oh, well, I see that America and China are having a little battle in the South China Sea. There's planes that are just missing each other all the time, and there's admirals who are warning each other of things all the time. But Australia is so far away. Is Australia immune because of its geography, because we are so far away from the inflection points?
No, we're right on top of China. We're really close to China. We're way too close to China. All of our trade goes through not only Indonesia, but through the South China Sea. We can't go south, and we can't go west or east and trade with the fish. All of our trade goes north, and China controls that sea, and they're going to become more and more powerful. A lot of our oil comes from the Middle East. It goes to Singapore, gets refined, and then comes to us. If China decides to blockade that area. Oh, this gives me a great opportunity to bring up something which I mentioned in a video a year ago. I mentioned piracy in Asia,
Oh, good.
and it was I got a lot of flack for that, and I had a lot of difficulty convincing people of modern day piracy. And luckily, what's happening with Iran and the UK right now and the oil tankers, this is exactly what I mean. A lot of and hopefully your viewers are aware what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. There's oil tankers. The UK pretty much did some modern day piracy and took an Iranian oil tanker, and then Iran just took a UK oil tanker. So this strategy, if I was China, see, the way I look at it is, I don't look at it from Australia's point of view. I look at it from China's point of view. All of my theories come from how the Chinese behave. And if I wanted all of those sweet resources that Australia has, that huge land mass, I would cut off our oil supply, and I would start enacting sanctions against Australia, and I would start taking our ships, like just literally take the ships and destroy our economy that way. And it's a real possibility in the upcoming years.
China piracy is an interesting one, because the last time I remember a big time that there was pirates was during a Chinese expansion period. I can't remember who the emperor was or what the dynasty was, but it was during the treasure fleet period when the treasure fleet was going out, and they were going throughout Southeast Asia. They got as far down as Sri Lanka, at least as far as it's documented, and they had to deal with pirates all over Southeast Asia, and they pretty much invaded Indonesia while they were there, and just wiped out that. But I mean, even back in those times, China had pretty much default capacity to rule over Southeast Asia, even though at the time, and every preceding emperor, and at the time, they were inwardly focused. China is a very inwardly focused country. I mean, they built a great wall to try and symbolize their inward lookingness, if you know what I mean. So we're in a great. So you're saying that? Are you saying that the psychology of the country is changing, that they don't want to be inwardly focused anymore?
Well, I guess to look at the history and just this is the arguments that is portrayed in the modern day media by people who I believe are paid off and brainwashed by the Chinese Communist Party, because what they want you to do is think that they're never going to invade until, surprise, surprise, you get nailed. They don't want you to prepare and protect yourself. So there's a lot of people writing books talking about the coming collapse of China. Don't worry about China. We're not going to threaten anybody. But when your economy is the size of theirs right now, you need a lot of resources. So what you do is you look at countries that have a lot of resources in their region. Australia's one of them. And we are under direct threat. There's no two ways about it. 100%, this country needs resources to keep their economy growing, and we have those resources, and we have a small population.
Traditionally, when Australia has been threatened by power from Asia, say Japan, right, or others, we have relied on the greater sea power. So at the first birth of our nation and prior, we relied on Great Britain, and then we moved to relying on the United States, which has been a continuous policy. What's wrong with that policy? Why are you talking like a nationalist? I don't mean disrespect, but you understand what I mean.
Nationalist as in I think the way I'm looking at it
why
is more
you're arguing about Australians should put resources into this when we've never really done that before. You understand? Like,
well, actually, if you look at the we're already putting resources in it. I don't think people are taking the amount of money that we are pumping into our military right now. America's largest arms market is Saudi Arabia, another resource-rich country full of people who don't know how to build things for themselves, exactly the same as Australia. Number two is Australia. Did you know that? So Australia is the United States' second largest arms market because we don't know how to build things ourselves. And as someone who I would like to see us build a few things ourselves, manufacturing. The unions are destroying industries left, right, and center, and we're not able to manufacture or do things for ourselves. So we find ourselves digging holes and sending those ships through for trade, and then just spending the money instead of. And then we've got a minimum wage, and we have unions, and we just can't manufacture for ourselves. But we are in fact pumping money into it already. So all I'm doing is pretty much letting you know what's actually happening, and the average Australian just watches the news on TV and has no idea what is coming.
So what you're saying is that the government is preparing for the China threat, but they're not telling the people that they're preparing for the China threat.
Of course, I wouldn't. You know how many? I'm Australian. I came from the ghetto. I'm as Aussie as it comes. I wouldn't want to alarm any Aussies. I wouldn't want them to know what's really coming. But I tell you, we are only a few years away from economic collapse, and my projection is 2034 that we will probably become a third world shithole. Dare I say it?
So there was the event a few months ago, or a month ago, I've lost track of time now, but the ships came into Sydney. Those warships came into Sydney. Is this, if you're a doctor, you've got to diagnose a patient. What happened there? Why did the government not let us know what was going on? Why did they suddenly, these ships appear, and everyone's like, hey, why are these warships in the Sydney Harbour? Is that a symptom, or is that just simply a bureaucratic mistake?
China doesn't have that much power over Australia just yet. They came in and they actually played a game of soccer with the Australian Navy, and the Chinese, they weren't allowed off the ship unless they got on buses and were, driven around Sydney. They were not allowed to roam freely, and as soon as they left, they were followed up the coast by the American military. And the reason why I understand why the Australian government wouldn't want to be too alarmist, because we are waking up. The average Australian is starting to see the threat and how big this threat is. And the politicians don't really want us doing anything too silly down here, because we are in a terrible situation. We're just waiting for our economy to collapse. It feels like it's inevitable, and we're just trying to hold on as long as we can, because China's eventually going to put sanctions on us. And we've got our fingers crossed, hoping that our great powerful friend, as they say, America, is going to do something about China, but it doesn't look like they're able to hold China off. China's so much more powerful than the Soviet Union ever was.
So yeah, because they actually have an economy, whereas the Soviet Union, if it wasn't communist, it would have had an economy, and it might have had a good shot. You argue, that Australia's under attack, and Australians are saying, well, then what can I do? You say this extradition treaty, this extradition bill, is a way to fight back, right? That this this whole mess that's going on is because Chinese people are sick of the CCP, and because it's not Chinese people, like it's a different argument, right? It's not that Chinese people are bad. It's there are allies that we can line up with, and they live in Hong Kong. They're there on the ground right now, and if we connect with these people, and if we help these people, and we assist these people, that we can fight back. Is that what you're saying with this extradition treaty in Hong Kong?
Well, I guess there is a newspaper called the Epoch Times, which states that there's, at the moment, I think it's 350 million people have against the Chinese Communist Party. The Taiwanese are obviously against the Chinese Communist Party. But if you look at it from America's point of view, America didn't get rich by getting involved in any wars. So if there is a war, the last thing America would want to do is get in a head-to-head battle with China. Again, by the way, I think a lot of people forget that the Korean War in the 1950s was against China. It's not North Korea. The Vietnam War in the 70s was against China. It had pretty much nothing to do with Vietnam. Now, America is trying to create another proxy war so that they can profit off it and somehow decline or slow down China's rise. So they had another look at North Korea, but North Korea has nukes. There's nothing they can do there. Then they started arming Taiwan, and it sounds terrible, but if you look at how America got rich in the first place, it was World War I, World War II. They didn't get involved in World War I or World War II until the last few months of each of those wars. They didn't even get involved. They just traded with everyone in Europe. And at the end of World War II, they got involved in the last 6 months. And by that stage, America had 2/3 of the world's gold. They had so much money that they pretty much ruled the world at that stage. So it's not in America's best interest to get in a head-to-head battle with anyone. Keep in mind, they went into Iraq and Afghanistan, which was really, a revenge play for 9/11, and they couldn't take out a few guys riding on donkeys with AK-47s. How do you think these guys are going to take on the Chinese military? And the Chinese people are tough. They get down and they will work 20 hours a day, sleep 4 hours, get up and do it again. I would hate to go up against those type of supply lines. And so what America's doing is poking around. They're looking at North Korea, Taiwan. They're looking at Vietnam again. They're looking at the Philippines. They're having a look at Iran now. There's a clear pattern here, and all of these countries are connected somewhat to China. The ideal situation or scenario would be to somehow suck China into a war with one of their neighbors, and then the West can get rich off trading with all of them again and remain in power, and then we can pass off China to the next generation. That's really the scenario. That's really what's going on. As long as people understand that, then they'll understand the threat that Australia's under, because while we're playing this game, China's playing their own game. Now, most Australians don't understand this game's being played. They have no idea this game's being played, and China does. And I wouldn't put it past China to make a big move in the coming years that will just blindside all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, if I put my geopolitical hat on right now and my neocon hat, I would say I would pick Pakistan. But the only problem with America picking Pakistan is they were a former ally, and they have nuclear weapons. But again, their nuclear weapons won't really reach the United States. And you could keep India out of that war, and you could almost have it through Pakistan. Iran, obviously, is the other one because they don't even have the nukes. So that's why they're looking at them. But they're a much bigger issue, much bigger problem. China, because China is such a diverse country. It's so big, it's so large, it has so many borders, so many countries, and so many people within its borders, and so many people around its borders. It's like 1 or 2/3 of the whole planet lives in the area of China, near that area. So we're talking about vast populations, diverse and complex geography, and a huge economy, as you're saying. So for Australia, you were talking about, and I watched your video on Hong Kong, and I thought it was excellent. By the way, I really highly recommend it. I'll put it in the link so people can watch it. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And you mentioned that you think that the Muslim issue, it may be some propaganda to keep people away from the China issue. Would you like to expand on that point? Because it's an enlightening point. I haven't heard it before, and I totally agree with you.
Oh, in Australia, yes, we do have a few. There's when you look at the raw data from the very beginning of Australia's only really had a few little terrorist attacks, and I went through and I counted that only 14 people have died from terrorist attacks in Australia in the last 200 years. So for the rhetoric in the media about terrorism and Australia being under threat from Muslims, the raw data just does not add up. More people have died from sugar today than have died from terrorist attacks in Australia. I know there was a Bali bombing, but that was what's happening in Indonesia, or has happened in Indonesia, was a direct result of Australia getting involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the Indonesians don't really blame Australians. They know that this is all America's wars. So what's happening in Australia is that there's a lot of rhetoric around Islam, and the Australians who have been brainwashed to believe this, they're only feeding in, and they're helping China's cause, because the ultimate goal, this is America's strategy, and China has learnt from America. The ultimate goal would be for Australia and Indonesia to get into a war, and China to trade with both of us and get even more rich, and then just come in and swoop up the rubble when we're finished tearing each other apart. Now, we have religious ideologues on both sides. We have a lot of Christians and Catholics in Australia, and then we have all the Muslims literally on our doorstep, and it is a tinderbox waiting to explode. And someone like me who doesn't necessarily believe in religion, I think that we need to somehow, we need to have a lot of, we need some good diplomats to make sure that nothing happens with Indonesia, because they are rising too, and they're projected to have the 5th largest economy in the world within a few years from now. And China is doing everything in their power to bring them into their sphere of influence by trading more with them. So the rhetoric around Muslims in Australia, there's also another factor which I'd like to bring up, is that in America they have an Israel lobby in America, and so what they do is they create a lot of fear around Muslims, and then that politically can convince the politicians in America to send money to protect Israel. So it's part of a strategy of fear-mongering about Islam, and to take our resources that we need to protect ourselves to go and send to the Middle East, and we don't necessarily want that. So there's a double game going on here, and if we feed into both of those games, the Australian people lose, and we collapse as a country, and we lose our freedoms. And that's unfortunately, I've just discussed this with you, and I guess a lot of people, when they hear that, they'll understand the rationale behind that. But I have little to no faith in the Australian people listening to someone like me and changing their ways. I actually believe that we're going to continue along this path, And by 2034, we're going to become a third world shithole, as I've said, because unless people wake up, that's the way we're heading.
Yeah, it's totally fine. I totally agree. It's a divide and conquer strategy. It's old, tried, tested, and true. Because as long as you're not a nation unified on specific goals, then you're divided on different things. And you said, as you said rightly, your resources are wasted. We're running out of time because I know you only wanted to stay around for 30 minutes, but that's fine. So I wanted to quickly touch on ban Wechat. Tell us about ban Wechat.
Well, I guess we should watch what's happening with Wechat, because if we were going to go to war, if America was to go to war, they would want to make sure that nobody's able to get messages back to China. And by banning Chinese social media, that will be one of there's often a canary in the coal mine, and that's one of them. So I'll be watching Wechat, and the day that Wechat disappears and you cannot access it in Australia, that's when the bombs start going off. And there's another topic that just finally, there's one more thing I'd like to talk about is Professor Hugh White, I believe his name is. He wrote a book. How to Defend Australia, I think it was. I haven't actually read the book, but what happened was I plan on reading the book soon. It only just came out. But 2 weeks ago, he appeared on Q&A, the ABC program, and part of the discussion was, should Australia have nuclear weapons to protect us? And he had a panel of people, and they all disagreed with him. They saw it as some sort of warmongering. They didn't see it as a defensive play. And I see it as a defensive play because we all know what happened in Libya with Gaddafi. They convinced Gaddafi to get rid of his nukes. And in 2011, the guy was assassinated. Now, they tried to do that with North Korea. North Korea didn't let go of their nukes. They're still alive. Iran wants nukes to protect themselves. Iran's still there, right? So nukes are a defensive play. They're not an offensive play. And I feel like there's so many bad actors in Australia that are trying to con us. And that panel, I think Hugh White was probably the worst person to sit at that panel because he didn't pitch his argument well enough. He didn't explain that it was a defensive play, and the Australian people got the wrong impression about nukes. It is definitely, because if just say for instance we got nukes now, China's not really going to be able to cause us too much trouble. They're not going to put sanctions on us now. But later on, China will then put sanctions on us and use that as an excuse. But if we've already got nukes in 10 years' time, then nothing's really changed, if you know what I'm trying to say. So, yeah, so this is something that happened recently. I was really disappointed with how that played out, because I feel like there's a lot of people who aren't really looking at it from a rational standpoint, and Australia is in a lot of trouble and people aren't taking it seriously.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned Hugh White, because I listened to a lecture of Hugh White's at ANU, and he's really worried about the Thucydides trap, which I know you've made videos. I know you know what that is about, and he's really worried about that. And he says nukes mitigate that trap. He said nukes mitigate the Thucydides traps because they promote mutual annihilation. And if you look through the Cold War, you don't end up with mutual annihilation. You end up with, at best, proxy wars in third world countries that mean nothing to anybody, right?
Yeah, and I think Australia has a lot to defend too. We have a lot of resources. There's a reason why Australia's had the highest standard of living in the world for the last decade. Melbourne's been one of the most livable cities. I think it was 7 years in a row, wasn't it? 7 or 8 years in a row. Melbourne was the most livable city in the world. We do have something to defend. And keep in mind, if you have a look at Venezuela in the 50s, Venezuela was a very rich, resource-rich, oil-producing country. But they weren't able to keep their heads about them. They weren't able to control their own country. They had this regional hegemon, America, that it wasn't in their interest to have a rich and powerful Venezuela. And Venezuela is our future. I envision Australia becoming Venezuela. It's an awful way to look at the world, at our future. But if we continue down this path and we don't start to unite and have rational politicians and people that actually care about this country, we're going to end up the next Venezuela.
You keep mentioning economic sanctions from China, and there's some reports in the media, all over Asian media, not much reported here in Australia, but they're holding $1 billion worth of coal in a coal terminal. Talk about that. Is that a new form of warfare, or is it customs just doing their customs thing? You know, the coal has got an infection or something.
15 million tons of a Australian thermal coal, I believe it is, $1 billion worth. It's just sitting in customs, and it has nothing to do with the coal. It has nothing to do with anything other than China punishing Australia for not doing their bidding. And the pattern is there. China is willing to use geo-economic warfare against its neighbors to get what it wants. And these are small plays by China now, and those plays are only going to become more and more aggressive. We do have American bases all over Asia right now, so there's only so much China can do. But if America gets pushed out of Asia, keep in mind, for America, there's really three parts of the world. The most important part is Asia. The second most important region of the world is the Middle East. And nobody cares about Europe anymore. I hate to say it, nobody cares about Europe.
Yeah.
There's nothing going on over there. Eventually, America may have to put all of their navy in Asia. If that doesn't go well and America gets entirely pushed out, John Mearsheimer talks about the Monroe Doctrine, where if you are a foreign power, you're not allowed to enter the Americas at all, or they will go to war with you. So John Mearsheimer talks about how China is developing their own Monroe Doctrine to say that nobody else is allowed to enter Asia. And when that happens, Australia is going to be at the whims of China, and that's happening faster than I think anyone realizes.
So the America has a lot of bases in Asia because of the Obama Asia pivot, right? We remember the Asia pivot, and they went and they put more resources from the Middle East and the Atlantic, and they threw them over into Asia. Trump is more of a isolationist, neo-reactionary. He's not as aggressive on foreign policy, though he hasn't done so much in Asia. Do you think that after Trump, do you think that they might they might move out of the Middle East a little more, but they might hold here, be able to hold here? Or do you think China's just going to be able to sweep America away, to its constituent parts, which is South Korea, Japan, maybe Taiwan, arguably, and that'd be about it, maybe Vietnam, maybe?
It's complex, but I would look at all the different countries and what their interests are in the region. So you did mention Pakistan. Pakistan, their main interest is to get the oil from the sea and get it to China and just trade and get rich. They just want to sit there and get wealthy. They've been poor for a long time. They don't want to get involved in anything. South Korea has not done anything America wants. South Korea could well be in bed with China already. I wouldn't trust them to do anything for Team Blue. It's pretty much Team Blue versus Team Red.
But South Korea only exists because of America. How I don't understand that argument. They owe everything to America.
Yes, they do. But they are. Nobody sees. None of the countries that are surrounded by that surround China see America as a threat. They see America as a distant power from a long way away that is more like the police, if anything. But South Korea has not done. They've done little to nothing. If anything, their behavior, is almost like the Trojan horse of Asia, and I'm pretty sure America is aware that they cannot trust South Korea. Now, South Korea is rich, and their entire they would be North Korea if the Allies didn't get involved. But for the South Koreans, their interest is not get bombed by North Korea, not get destroyed by China. So they would rather just sit there, trade, stay out of it. They're not going to want to get involved in anything. The only countries that really have an invested interest is Taiwan, and Taiwan, we don't necessarily know how long they're going to be able to hold on. And Japan, it's all about interests and what would their agenda be. If America and Australia was not allied with Japan or friends with Japan, they would be in a lot of trouble. So I would trust Japan very much so. They're one of the few countries that I would trust everything that they do and say and to back it up. South Korea, no. Taiwan is being armed right now. It's hard to tell. There's a lot of pressure being put on Singapore as well. And India, to be honest, we don't know what India is doing. They are part of the Quad. There's India and Japan are good buddies at the moment on paper, but the rhetoric and the action, they don't really add up sometimes. This is why I see China winning.
Japan is technically de-armed as well, because they're still under Constitution number 9 or 69 or something like that. It's Article 9 or something like that, where they're officially de-armed. So they haven't yet armed. So they have Japanese self-defense force, Japanese self-defense armies, Japanese self-defense air force. You get the picture. It's all self-defense. They have a huge civilian sector, which is where their technology comes from, plus huge civilian corporations. So they've been able to make leaps and bounds in technology areas. But yeah, officially they're disarmed, but they're going through a population dearth. They're not having any babies to replace themselves. I'm very and I know that South Korea and Japan hate each other historically, but I would have thought personally, and this is good news. I like this analysis, that South Korea would have been so scared of China that it would have just done anything to leech on to, the Japan Pax Americana and a Japanese American relationship.
They put in the THAAD missile defense system a few years ago. And when that happened, the Chinese stopped tourism to South Korea. South Koreans were being beaten up in the street in China. Massive shopping centers, Lotte supermarkets, like a big supermarket, the Chinese government stepped in, and as they do, they make up an excuse to destroy you economically. and they came along and shut down all of these shopping centers in China, saying that they had they had all these hygiene problems, and they just made up excuses. And this caused a lot of trouble for South Korea's economy. At that point, South Korea realized that they were stuck between a rock and a hard place, not only politically, economically, and militarily, because they have this basket case literally on their doorstep. So if you look at their situation, I would hate to be in their situation, but I would have zero faith in them doing anything for our team. Also, keep in mind, Japan is full of Japanese. It sounds silly, but Australia is not full of Australians. Now, Japan doesn't have mass immigration. They don't have... Japan's full of Japanese, so...
homogenous.
Yeah, if Japan wants to protect Japan, it's easy to put policies in place to protect their own interests. In Australia, like when I saw Hugh White on Q&A, I just saw enemies of Australia on that panel pitching arguments for our enemies. I don't see many people in even the Australian government doing things for us. And we do have a lot of people that vote against our best interest, because keep in mind, you and me, if something goes down, you and me are going to jail. We're getting locked up. Genocide's there's gonna be some sort of a genocide. We have nowhere to go because we are Australians. Australia does have a lot of immigrants that always have a backup plan, and that's to go back to whatever country they came from. You know, they can go back there, and if something happens, if Australia gets involved in a war and our government says, look, we need you to join the Navy and fight for Australia, and they go, hang on a second, I just got to go on a quick trip back home and I'll be back. I promise you I'll be back. Then they don't come back. This is the difference between Australia and Japan, and we got to keep in mind that there are a lot of people with different agendas in Australia right now, and it's very complex.
Yeah, it is. It's super complex, and you're right. I think that Australians, multiculturalism, it's not always what it's topped out to be. But if you want a good and strong economy, well, it's great, I guess. I mean, that's what we've done it for. That's the reason that we have the society that we have, is to make money. So, I mean, that's what they've done it for. But yeah, on national cohesion and, national identity and a whole bunch of other issues, it's just, it makes everything else irrelevant. So yeah, so Japan, South Korea is obviously homogenous as well, and the North Koreans, well, yeah, they're religiously homogenous, and China is pretty diverse demographically, but they're mainly Han Chinese that we're talking about, which are all in the sort of coastal regions. What about China's demographics? China had the one-child policy. They've hurt themselves. Is that an argument that they might, decline inwardly again prematurely, even depending on what you're talking about?
That was brought up on Q&A.
There you go.
Said that, but I've read a few books. Gordon Chang wrote one, and David Shambaugh wrote one as well. And their argument is that as China's... there's two parts to it which have both failed. These theories don't hold any water, in my opinion. As China would grow economically, they would move towards democracy. In fact, they've gone the opposite direction. They've become more of an authoritarian state. That's one of their arguments which has failed. The second argument is what you just said, that they're in too much debt, and that they're an aging population, they're going to collapse. That has not happened either. They still, even though we don't necessarily know what their real growth rate is, I would argue that the hardworking, poor Chinese that are willing to, that are able to build massive buildings within 48 hours or 100 days, they're able to build an entire, they build things fast, they're efficient, they're hardworking, whereas in America, it takes them 7, 8 years to build a little bridge. And in China, they build the same bridge within 40. They're efficient. That's economics for you. If you look at Sydney CBD, I think it's been 6 years. We're trying to build a little tram that goes a couple 100 meters. And we're still doing it because, well, we got the unions and we have a lot of, we're inefficient. You see, now, the debt argument, well, America's in something like $20 trillion debt. It's doubled since the GFC, and eventually they're going to have to change their monetary system so that the American dollar will have to be changed again. And international politics is gangster. It's literally like the mafia. And if America owes $20 trillion to China, just if they do owe all of it, they just say, no, we're not paying you. What are you going to do about it? We're just going to change our monetary system. And they might lose a lot of foreign direct investment. A lot of people will probably pull a lot of money out of America. But that's where we're heading, really. America's got a lot more debt than China. But the Chinese, we also look at it in terms of American dollars, and we forget that there's no real minimum wage in China. They're willing to work for little to nothing and all day, when you have a lot of overweight Americans sitting on the couch eating Cheetos that wouldn't get off the couch for under $30 an hour. So when you look at it from that point of view, I would bet on China every day. This economy is not collapsing. These people are not lazy. They don't have a lot of social media where they throw around a lot of ideas. They just get to work. And America's full of bad ideas right now. And if you look at I've got a lot of theories about what's going on with America right now, which I can't say yet, but in a few years, there's some nasty things that are going to happen in America, and it's politically I would get murdered if I said some of the things which I'm going to say in the future. The same way a few years ago, I wouldn't say anything bad about China until people wake up. So America's in a lot more trouble than I think the rest of us realize. Let's just put it that way.
In the last few minutes of this interview, I'd like to just ask you, you're a very brave person. You speak on these issues. I think that's very brave. I think that's very resilient. I think you have a very strong sense of character. How do you do it? Where do you draw the energy and the strength from? And how do you encourage other people to do that, to take up arms?
Okay, well, just
in a verbal way, in a metaphorical. I don't mean literal arms.
Well, eventually, I see a lot of Australians like you and me becoming so poor that we will hit the streets. That I believe will happen in the not too distant future. So I believe, and I've been quite accurate up until till today, my awful theories have progressively come true, and they're only going to get a lot worse. So in the next 10-15 years, I see Australia, I guess when you hear someone like me say, oh, Australia's going to become a third world country and there's going to be gated Chinese communities, and if a white man's driving around Australia, the police, who's controlled by this new authoritarian government, which is controlled by the Chinese, and you'll get pulled over and shot in the head. I actually see this happening. It's terrible. It's an awful future. But it is not too brave for me to speak out now if in 15 years that is our future. That's not really that brave, because I actually believe that this is where we're heading. So 2022 and 2034, a lot of awful things are going to happen if we keep going in the same direction that we're going today. So really, I'm not that brave. I just know that we're all in a lot of trouble in 15 years, and I'm going to get, if my predictions play the way I see them playing out, we're all in a lot of trouble anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, David Lee. So thank you again for coming on the show. We're going to have you on as a regular guest in order to update us on things to do with China, because you're an expert on China. You've got your eye on China, and we thank you very much for that. Thank you for your service. And yeah, so and keep being brave, and your channel is great, so I'll push people there, and it's fantastic. So is there anything else you'd like to say before we cut this transmission of Detonation?
Well, I guess we'll keep in touch, and yeah, whenever you want someone to come on, I'll come on and have a chat. I'm willing to chat with anyone that wants to talk about China, and get the message out, because I think a lot of Australians are asleep right now. But yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
No problem. Yeah, your future reminds me of Brazil, you know, with the gated communities, and the rich people live up here, and the favelas are down here, and it's a mess. Being all run out of Beijing, you know, and you're right, because all of the countries that are ever colonized by that country are run like that. They're run like a mafia state. They're not you know, they're not looked after. They don't become an asset. They become a colony, like a neglected colony.
Yeah.
All right.
Already becoming a colony. But
Thank
yeah,
you very much, Dave Lee from Detonation. All more episodes of Detonation coming your way. TheUnshackled.net.